After a car accident, the female lead's arranged husband, Scott Nicholson, suddenly undergoes a complete personality transformation. Once a cold, stern CEO who always kept his distance, he unexpectedly becomes a doting wife addict, gentle and incredibly clingy. When the female lead visits him at the hospital, she's stunned to hear Scott reject a nurse with the excuse, "My wife wouldn't be happy," accompanied by a tender look and a warm smile, something he had never shown before. Scott's sudden change confuses both the medical staff and the female lead. Not only does he hold her hand and affectionately call her wife, but he also asks her to praise him for behaving well, like a loyal puppy waiting for a treat. Even after doctors confirm he suffered no brain trauma, Scott insists on being discharged, continuing to act spoiled, asking to sleep in the same bed and even demanding his wife pick out his pajamas, leaving the female lead helpless and exhausted. She becomes increasingly puzzled by how someone who was once so aloof and serious could suddenly cling to her like this, acting both sweet and childishly needy. Though she remains suspicious, her heart gradually begins to soften in response to his, slightly over-the-top, sincerity. This dramatic shift not only turns their previously dull marriage upside down but also hints at deeper secrets behind his behavior. After returning home from the hospital, Scott continues his obedient and clingy behavior. He not only moves into the master bedroom on his own but also packs and unpacks every item himself, refusing help, as if to prove he's the official husband. When he sees his wife flustered, he turns even more playful, insisting that because he was a good boy and didn't let the nurse touch him, he deserves a reward. At first, the female lead finds it all bothersome, but she can't deny the unexpectedly adorable side of the once icy man. He reminds her of the golden retriever she used to have as a child, always seeking attention, loving head pats, and sticking close whenever he felt neglected. One night, after sharing an intimate and passionate moment together, Scott continues behaving like a love-struck teenage boy, bashful yet excited, asking for another reward with an innocent twinkle in his eyes. Not only that, Scott also began expressing his desire for a long-term relationship, driving his wife to and from work, demanding a morning kiss every day, and even being overjoyed when she gifted him a puppy, which, coincidentally, looked strikingly like both him and the golden retriever she once had. However, beneath that sweet exterior, the female lead started to feel uneasy. Late at night, when he thought she was asleep, Scott would turn quiet and pensive, his gaze filled with hidden thoughts, and there was even a faint scent of cigarette smoke, something the new Scott supposedly avoided entirely. One day, she accidentally saw a strange message on his phone from an unknown man that read, "She doesn't love you. Give her back to me." At this point, Scott's dramatic change no longer seemed like a simple case of post-accident trauma. The female lead began to wonder, was he hiding something? Was this sweetness all just a facade? And if so, what was his true motive? Was it love, or something deeper? After days of clinginess and puppy-like behavior, their relationship began to shift emotionally. Though she had been skeptical and resistant to Scott's sudden transformation, the female lead slowly found herself moved by his tenderness, sincerity, and his adorably awkward efforts. She could no longer deny that her heart was wavering, especially seeing a man once known for his pride and emotional distance now trying so hard to compromise, be affectionate, and learn how to love. That night, after watching a movie together and chatting comfortably, Scott suddenly wrapped his arms around her from behind. At first, she tried to pull away, keeping her guard up. But his warmth, and the earnest look in his eyes, gradually broke through her defenses. In that moment, all doubts and masks fell away. They spent the night together in passion and emotion, for the first time, not out of marital obligation or pretense, but because of genuine desire and affection. What surprised the female lead even more was that Scott was nothing like the cold, reserved man she had once known. He was both gentle and intense, as if he had been holding back his feelings for a very long time. And after that night, instead of acting shy or distant as she had expected, Scott became even more affectionate, thrilled, almost childishly proud, as if he had just won a great victory. The next morning, Scott got up early to prepare breakfast, saw his wife off at the door with a bright smile, and leaned in, pointing to his cheek. "From now on, I want the official goodbye kiss every morning." He even set alarms to text her reminders to eat lunch, dress warmly, and come home early, as if he were competing in a contest to prove who loved more. The female lead felt both touched and confused. The man who used to be cold and distant now seemed like a completely different person. More notably, she began to realize that Scott wasn't just changing to please her, it was as if he had been bottling up all this affection for a very long time, just waiting for the right moment to show it. Yet deep down, she still sensed something was missing. Sometimes, she caught Scott looking at her with eyes full of tenderness, and something else, a hint of regret. As if he were clinging to something he feared he might lose, and so, questions began to form in her mind. When did Scott start loving her, before or after the accident? Was it really the accident that changed him, or had these feelings always been there, silently growing all along? Just as things between her and Scott began to blossom into something sweet and intimate, an all too familiar name suddenly appeared: Ryan Baldwin, the ex who once shattered her heart. Ryan returned after years of silence, this time claiming he wanted to make amends and apologize for leaving without a word. His unexpected appearance was like a cold wind sweeping through the warmth that had just begun to return to her life. Ryan quickly began finding excuses to approach her, sending flowers to her office, asking to meet and talk. Although the female lead clearly maintained her distance and emphasized that she was now married, Ryan remained persistent, saying, "You've never truly forgotten me," and trying to rekindle old memories. This left her feeling confused and emotionally drained. Scott found out almost immediately. But unlike his usual gentle and patient demeanor, he began to show signs of jealousy and possessiveness, picking her up from work, sticking close to her at home, and even unexpectedly showing up at her office, just to check that she wasn't with Ryan. Once, he boldly slung his arm around her shoulder in front of Ryan, speaking in a cool, pointed tone, "My wife's a bit busy now, Mr. Ryan." However, Scott's jealousy went beyond what one might expect from a loving husband. His reactions became strangely intense. Every time Ryan's name came up, Scott's eyes darkened, and his smiles grew colder and more forced. One night, thinking she was asleep, Scott stepped out onto the balcony to make a call. In a low voice, he said, "I told you not to let him near her again." That sentence startled her, not just because of the firm tone, but also because of the way he referred to Ryan, as if Scott were confronting someone with a deeper connection than she realized. Ryan's return didn't just shake their relationship, it also began to expose fragments of a secret Scott had been hiding all along. Ryan dropped cryptic hints about Scott's true identity, and someone who had once been a stand-in, which sent the female lead spiraling further into suspicion. Scott was her husband, that was unquestionable. But was the man standing beside her now truly Scott? As the ambiguities piled up, the female lead realized she was caught in the middle of two men, an ex who had once betrayed her, and a present husband who was becoming increasingly lovable, yet mysteriously scripted, because now, more than just love was being tested, identities, and the past itself, were on the verge of unraveling. After several tense days following Ryan's reappearance, the female lead began paying closer attention to Scott's strange but seemingly earnest behavior. Though he remained as sweet and clingy as before, she couldn't shake the growing feeling that every tender gesture he made was somehow rehearsed. It lacked the spontaneity of true emotion. Instead, it felt studied, perfect, and just a little too theatrical. One day, while cleaning Scott's home office while he was out, she accidentally discovered a locked box in the drawer. Curious, since Scott was never the type to hide things, she searched and found a key tucked inside a book. When she opened the box, What she found left her stunned: a stack of thick books, all romance novels and love handbooks. The titles were enough to make her laugh out loud. The cold CEO dotes on his silly wife, 36 strategies to win over a modern wife. The boss demands morning and night kisses, how to act cute so your wife forgives you. There were even self-help books like Understanding Women's Psychology, The Key to Loving Them, and 10 Dream Husband Archetypes According to Women. Tucked between the books were countless handwritten notes, neatly marked and annotated by chapter. Kiss her forehead in the morning, don't let her eat spicy food when she has stomach pain, practice giving sincere compliments. She was both amused and touched. It turned out all of Scott's over-the-top sweetness had a reason. He had been studying, bit by bit, from romance novels and guidebooks, just to become the kind of husband she dreamed of. The man who was once cold and emotionally reserved had chosen the clumsiest but most sincere way to love her, by learning it from books and copying every little detail. That night, she casually asked, "Have you been reading anything lately?" Scott immediately panicked, avoiding her eyes. "No, nothing special, just some financial reports." His flustered expression was so adorably pitiful that she couldn't help but laugh. Finally, she held up one of the books. "How about How to Get Your Wife to Hold Your Hand First? That one's a good read, right?" Scott turned beet red and shyly admitted, he didn't know how to be a good husband, didn't know how to love someone properly, so he had no choice but to learn. Because after the accident, he realized that if he didn't hold on to her, he would lose the most important woman in his life forever. That confession made her heart melt. He wasn't perfect, in fact, he was a little clumsy and silly in how he showed love, but it was that very sincerity and effort that, for the first time, made her want to reach out and hold his hand first. And this time, not out of pity, not out of duty, but because she truly felt moved. She thought that after discovering Scott had secretly been reading romance novels and learning how to be the perfect husband, their life would slowly become peaceful and blissful. But the storm came again, this time not in the form of excessive sweetness, but in a burst of anger she had never seen from Scott before. One evening after work, on her way home, the female lead accidentally saw Scott and Ryan standing face to face in the quiet parking lot behind her office building. She hid behind a wall, about to step out, when she heard Scott's voice, low, steady, but filled with anger. "Stay away from my wife. This is the last time I'm warning you." Ryan remained calm, smirking as he replied, "Your wife? If she were truly your wife, why the need for such theatrics? Who even are you?" In that moment, the female lead noticed something in Scott's eyes, no longer the gentle, sweet gaze she was used to, but something darker, firm, fiercely protective. He stepped closer to Ryan, speaking each word with clenched teeth. "I don't care who you were in her past. But now and in the future, I won't let her be hurt ever again." Having seen everything, the female lead finally stepped out. Both men were startled. Scott immediately turned toward her, worry written all over his face, but she said nothing, just gently took his hand and led him away. The air between them on the way home was thick with silence. That night, during a tense conversation at home, she questioned him, "Why do you feel the need to play the perfect husband to such extremes? Why were you so jealous you had to confront Ryan like that? This isn't like you." Scott bit his lip, his eyes filled with sorrow. He didn't defend himself, didn't offer excuses, he simply said, "I just don't want to lose you, so even if I go overboard sometimes, I'm willing to risk it." But to her, it no longer felt like innocent charm. She felt trapped in a relationship that was half real, half staged, where emotions were wrapped in rehearsed lines, copied gestures from romance novels, and jealousy that spun out of control. So, she decided to move out for a while to think things through. Before she left him with one sentence: "If this is all just a performance, then I need time to figure out whether my heart loves you, or just the role you've been playing." Scott stood frozen in their now empty home, and for the first time, realized learning to be a husband from books wasn't enough. He needed to learn how to be honest, so that love would no longer be an act, but a genuine connection between two people. After she moved out, Scott became a different man, no longer the cold CEO, nor the romance novel husband with textbook sweetness. Now, he was like a heartbroken puppy, desperately following her around, hoping for a chance to be forgiven. Upon learning that she had rented a small apartment in the old neighborhood where she'd lived during college, Scott immediately rented the unit right next to hers. The neighbors were baffled. Isn't he some rich CEO? What's he doing here? But Scott didn't care. He just wanted to be close to her. Every day, without fail, he would coincidentally wait at the stairwell in the early morning to offer her a ride to work. And every evening, he'd accidentally be standing in the courtyard, asking, "Have you had dinner yet? I tried cooking seaweed soup today, still clumsy, but I tasted it, it's not that bad." Though she remained cold and even tried to ignore him, she couldn't deny one thing: Scott now looked pitifully worn out. The dark circles under his eyes were obvious, his stubble grew messily, and the aura of a sharp CEO was gone. His expensive suits had been swapped for hoodies and slippers. He truly was trying his best. One day, during a heavy downpour, she came home from work without an umbrella. At the alleyway's entrance, she saw Scott standing under a small awning, already soaked from having given up most of the dry space to shelter an old lady. When he saw her, he rushed over and shyly handed her a tiny umbrella. "I brought an extra one." "Not sure if it's good enough," she said. Nothing. Once upon a time, he had always appeared as the perfect man, confident, composed, steady. But now, he was clumsy, silly, even a bit pathetic. And yet, that very vulnerability was what slowly softened her heart. Though she hadn't officially forgiven him, she no longer treated him so harshly. He was now allowed to bring her food, accompany her to the grocery store, even sit nearby when she watched movies. Each time she called his name, Scott would light up like a child being praised. One day, as they sat side by side on a park bench, she asked quietly, "Why do you keep acting like you're following a script? Why not just love me, in your own way?" Scott lowered his head, took her hand, and replied softly but sincerely, "Because I was afraid my real self wouldn't be enough. But now I understand, you don't need a performance. You need a husband who dares to be honest, clumsy, and willing to make things right." That was the first time she didn't pull her hand away. And also the first time Scott felt, maybe he was finally being loved, not for a role he played, but for his real self, awkward but genuine. As their relationship slowly began to thaw, she was invited to dinner at Scott's mother's house. It began as a casual social visit, but that night unexpectedly revealed a long-buried secret, a memory seemingly forgotten by everyone. While waiting for dessert, Scott's mother quietly led her into the living room and gently placed an old leather-bound photo album on the table. "Sweetheart, I think you should see this before making your final decision." Curiously flipping through the pages, the woman was stunned to find photos of herself from childhood, kindergarten picnics, school festivals, even mundane moments on the neighborhood playground. In every photo, there was always a boy in the background, smiling at her from afar. "This boy, is that me?" she asked, pointing to the boy with a silent but warm gaze. "That's Scott," his mother answered, eyes filled with nostalgia. "He's always been like that. Watching you from afar. When you moved away, he was depressed for a whole month. When he found out you'd be attending the same university, he was so excited he couldn't sleep. But he never had the courage to approach you." She was speechless. So Scott's love hadn't bloomed after the accident, nor was it something he learned from romance novels. It was a sincere, quiet affection that had lasted since childhood. In a middle school group photo, they stood close together. She had laughed brightly after receiving a prize, while Scott silently stood beside her, looking at her with gentle eyes. eyes she'd never noticed before. He hides his feelings well. When you married someone else, he drank alone and showed up at work like nothing happened. When he finally decided to propose, the accident happened. That shock, maybe it broke his mask and let his true feelings slip through. That night, she sat in her small apartment, silent for a long time. Scott's mother's words echoed in her mind, and the images replayed like a film. She began to understand why Scott had tried so hard, not because he wanted to please her with a perfect performance, but because he had loved her all his life and didn't know how else to show it. The next morning, for the first time, she knocked on the apartment next door. When Scott opened the door, before he could say a word, she held up the photo album and asked, "How long were you planning to hide the fact that you've loved me since you were 8? Scott froze. She smiled. "I think it's time for us to start over, not with fiction, but with real memories." After discovering that Scott had secretly loved her since childhood, she began to view everything he had done, from the clumsiness to the sweetness, the silent watching to his puppy-like clinginess, in a completely new light. His affection was no longer an act after the accident but the belated effort of someone who had always been afraid of losing the person he loved. One afternoon, while having tea at their favorite bakery, she asked softly, "I still don't quite understand. What really happened before the accident?" Scott went quiet. He stared out the window for a long time, then began to speak in a low, remorseful voice. It turned out that on the day of the accident, Scott had just finished a major meeting when he suddenly got news that Ryan, the ex who almost married the female lead, had returned to town and reached out to her. The one who delivered the message was none other than Scott's assistant, along with the cold line, "Seems like they still have feelings." Scott said nothing at the time, but his hands clenched the steering wheel. On the way home, only one thought ran through his mind: what if she goes back to Ryan? What if I lose her again? His entire life, Scott had watched her from the sidelines, always keeping a safe distance. He had convinced himself, as long as she's happy, that's enough. But once he had her, the fear of losing her again only grew stronger. In that brief moment before the crash, Scott was distracted, frantically trying to call her, but she didn't answer. Panic, fear, helplessness, all of it overwhelmed him and made him lose control. The accident didn't leave any serious injuries, but it was a wake-up call. When he woke up in the hospital, his first thought wasn't pain, it was, how do I keep her with me? At that moment, he noticed a romance novel on the bedside table, left behind by a nurse. While waiting for his strength to return, Scott read half the book, and was surprised to see himself in the male lead, awkward, quiet, secretly in love. That was the start of his romantic novel husband plan, learning the lines, the gestures, even how to pout at the right moments to soften her heart. Not because he wanted to pretend, but because it was the only way he knew to hold on to her. When he finished telling his story, Scott bowed his head slightly. "I know I've probably been foolish. But if it means you'll stay, I'm willing to be a fool forever." She sat there, silent. All her past resentment seemed to melt away, replaced by a deep ache and a quiet warmth. Because real love, no matter how clumsy or imperfect, always finds a way to touch the heart. Not long after, a rare opportunity arose. The Baldwin family was hosting a grand family banquet to officially announce the new heir of the corporation. Ryan, naturally the top candidate, was scheduled to deliver an important speech. But behind the glamorous stage, the female lead and Alice Baldwin, Ryan's younger sister who had long harbored resentment toward him, were secretly executing a plan to expose his true colors. Alice, who had once been manipulated by Ryan in a shady financial deal, had unearthed evidence of his string of love affairs and illicit investment funds. The female lead, playing the role of the well-mannered ex, discreetly handed a USB containing the data to Mr. Baldwin during the banquet. Ryan passionately droned on about vision and professional ethics, a staff member unexpectedly approached Mr. Baldwin on stage and whispered something into his ear. Instantly, the atmosphere in the ballroom grew heavy. Not long after, Mr. Baldwin solemnly announced the termination of all of Ryan's powers, transferring the heir position to Alice and sending Ryan on an indefinite overseas assignment under the pretext of moral reflection and mindset adjustment. The drama concluded swiftly, no scandal, no shouting, yet shockingly effective. Scott, who had quietly observed the entire incident from a distance, gently squeezed the female lead's hand. For the first time, he realized, she didn't need protection, she was the one protecting their love with brilliance and strength. A week later, on her birthday, Scott pulled off a surprise no one had expected. He invited her back to the countryside, the very place where they had taken their first photo together as children, and organized a romantic picnic in the middle of a lavender field. As the sunset touched the top of the hill, Scott knelt down and opened a small box, revealing a rare pink diamond, the symbol of pure and eternal love. He said, "I used to be the boy who could only watch you silently from afar. But now, I want to stand beside you openly, not playing a role, not living a romance novel, just as myself." She laughed through her tears and nodded. And this time, there were no doubts, no performances, just two real people, loving each other in the truest way. After the romantic proposal with the pink diamond and his heartfelt confession, everything seemed perfect, until the female lead unexpectedly threw cold water on Scott. On the drive back, both touched and amused, she teased, "You don't have to copy those romance novels anymore. Sometimes it feels like you're auditioning for the role of CEO madly in love with his wife." Scott's eyes widened, cheeks flushed red like a tomato. "But I thought those books had great advice. They say to keep your wife, you need to initiate hugs, kisses, buy handbags, and lose every argument on purpose. And I don't think any book tells you to do a Princess Carrie every time I walk more than 500 meters, you dork." Ever since their official engagement, life had become more relaxed and joyful than ever. Scott was still his wife-obsessed self, waking up early to cook breakfast, leaving love notes everywhere, scheduling spa appointments, and setting alarms to remind her to drink water. But this time, he was no longer trying to be the perfect husband from a novel. He was simply himself, thoughtful, a little clumsy, and completely lovable. While cleaning out a cabinet one day, the female lead stumbled upon another stack of books, titles like 1001 Ways to Apologize at the Right Time, Being a Good Husband Isn't Hard If You Learn to Listen, and Understanding Women Through Memes. She could only shake her head in disbelief. "You seriously collected all of these?" Scott scratched his head, stammering, "Just in case you get mad and I don't know why. Now I have a quick reference guide." Despite being regularly exposed for his over-the-top antics, Scott never felt embarrassed. In fact, he was proud that he could make his wife laugh. He once said, "When you laugh, I feel like I've won the title of best husband in the world." They no longer lived under the pressure of having to be perfect by any societal mold. Instead, they learned to be gentle, patient, and to love each other sincerely, in their own way. The female lead gradually came to accept that her silly husband would always be that loyal puppy with a clueless expression every time she got angry. But at the same time, he was the kind of man willing to learn anything, just to understand and love her better. The story ends on a cozy evening, with the two of them lying down together, watching old childhood photos where a young Scott stood nervously beside a little girl with big round eyes. The female lead burst out laughing and teased, "So you started crushing on me back when I still wore overalls?" Scott nodded earnestly, "I hold the record for longest pursuit in history. Almost 30 years, beat that." And then, they laughed together, a laugh shared by two people who had finally found the right person, at the right time, and a love that was truly real.